Okay, so Betsy Levy Paluck needs no introduction. Many of you know her as a professor at Princeton, and many of you may know that she's won a MacArthur, and I think most of you know that she's just like great. And you know, when people talk about Betsy behind her back, it is just only in terms of like superlative admiration. I really look forward to this talk. I know a lot of you do too. So with that brief introduction, Betsy, I'm going to cede the floor to you. Thank you so much.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to be talking today, and thank you for having me so much. I'm going to be talking about some more meta research that we've been doing in my lab lately, and it's some of the research that I'm most proud of in the past couple of years. So I'm really excited to bring it to you. It's not one of my typical talks about interventions that we have been running and testing, but rather a look at the whole field for the past dozen years. And this is research that I've been doing with Ronnie Porat, who was my postdoc and now is at Hebrew University, with Chelsea Clark, who is a current graduate student of mine, and with Donald Green at Columbia, my former mentor, my always mentor, but my former advisor in graduate school. We just published this in the annual review of psychology last month, and so you can find it there or email me for a copy if you can't find it. It asks the question, what works to reduce prejudice? And we started this, long before this summer, when a lot of the world caught up to wanting to know this question as well. And so it arrived in time, and I'm curious to see what you think of the answers. It follows up on a paper that I had completed at the end of being a graduate student, took me years to do, which was a review of what works to reduce prejudice, that we started searching in the literature really at the dawn of psychology. And we searched beyond psychology in the social sciences and biomedical sciences and the gray literature, so published and unpublished. In that previous review, what we did was we just wrote it as a narrative review, because our main finding was that we weren't treating the question of what causes prejudice reduction with any degree of seriousness, that there were so many correlational studies, there were so many surveys that we really had to get serious about causally identifying the precursors to prejudice reduction. And so this paper was really our way of saying, okay, it's been a dozen years, what's happened since then? Okay, and so these are the three questions that we posed. What's happened? What are the average effects of interventions? So now we decided to limit our search to just experiments that could say something about the causal effects of prejudice reduction interventions, and to actually empirically meta-analyze their outcomes. And then finally, taking all of that in, the question was, can social science answer the public's call, which recently grew a lot louder, to reduce prejudice in the world? And I'm just going to preview the answers for you right now. Let's get right to it, and I'll spend the rest of my time telling you how we got there. So first of all, we find a sharp uptick in prejudice reduction research. And some of these studies are just going to become classics. You're going to hear about them in your favorite behavioral science podcasts. They're going to be taught in behavioral science courses. So there's some real good news, some real templates for how to do your own research or how to move things forward as practitioners. However, the modal research is very different from these future classics. And of course, that's part definitional. The mode is always different from the outliers. But they're not just different in form or in the types of outcomes, but in part, they're different because there are many reasons not to trust the majority of the research. And so I'm going to talk about what I mean by that. But in particular, and most concerning, is that some of the most popular prejudice reduction ideas out there in the world, or the ones most dearly held by academics, are not well supported. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that. And to me, what is the most sobering out of this review, which is that the most rigorous research shows very small reductions in prejudice. Okay, so those are our answers. And I'm going to end the talk by talking about what we think the next generation of prejudice reduction research and intervention should look like, but in particular by going beyond the data to editorialize a little bit, to ask whether we're using the right model of change, and whether we need to update how we're thinking about change in this instance of prejudice reduction. Okay, so that's the talk. Let me tell you how we got there. So first, the point about this big uptick in prejudice reduction research. So here's what it looks like. That black line is just all prejudice reduction studies starting back in 2007 up to 2019 when our search ended. And it splits it out by what type of research we found. So the uptick is mostly being driven by that blue and red line detailing laboratory studies and online studies, particularly on Amazon's mTurk. We were very excited to see whether field experiments were on the rise, but they're sort of, puttering down there at about 1 to 3 per year. And you're not going to be able to really take in this chart, but this is really just to show you, this is how we got that chart. This is how we came about this database, the whole population of prejudice reduction research. This is a Prisma chart. Everything that we did, all of our code, all of our data, the list of all the studies is on Dataverse. We followed biomedical meta-analytic standards for this study so that everything is transparent and replicable. And so what we did was started by searching 5 separate databases. And again, we did not search just within psychology, just within economics, just within the social sciences even. It was a very, very broad search that across those 5 different searches ended up in over 16,000 results that took us a while with a trained group of master's levels researchers to sort through. We narrowed that down. The PIs reviewed 1,800 studies in full. And our criteria was that it had to address and try to reduce some kind of prejudice that we defined very broadly as animus, just writ large, whether that was behavioral in nature, an emotion, an attitude, a belief, etc. We left out studies of sexism, trying to reduce sexism, because that's a very based, perhaps unfortunately, on a very different literature, and we were following the previous review. We also excluded partisan. This is a very new area of research that I predict will get a lot more important in the next few years. There aren't too many studies on reducing partisan prejudice out yet, but look for this. And it had to be experimental, okay? So in our final sample, we had about 418 experiments, and we coded all of these studies. I want to mention here that we've recently received a grant to put all of the studies online and to serve as a clearinghouse going forward for studies of prejudice reduction. So, watch that space. Okay, so I said that several prejudice reduction studies are destined to become classics. We say this because they're very robust and what we would call realistic interventions. So these are the types of interventions that you can imagine fielding, putting into place in corporations, in communities, in schools, et cetera. So they're really attuned to both the social processes as well as to the psychological ones. They're not just really pared down sort of proof of concept type of interventions. They're really well described, et cetera. And then there's really robust methods being used to test them. They're using large sample sizes. They're measuring behavior, not just self-reports. There's savvy attention to randomization. If people drop out, they take care of that with appropriate statistical techniques. They pre-register, they make their data available. And so there's a wide range of studies. We describe all of them. We call them the landmark studies in detail in our paper. But one thing that really unites them, which is interesting, is that they all report promising but limited findings, and that there are positive outcomes, but there's small changes. And so this is a little bit of a, sort of forecasting or a, foreshadowing of something I'm going to talk about later. But let me tell you about just a couple of these future classics. One, actually, these are a pair of studies done separately at the same time by 2 doctoral students, Matt Lowe and Salma Musa. And if you've been following it, they were recently published this year. Salma Musa, for example, was on the cover of Science magazine. They both tested contact theory, this idea that bringing rival groups into contact with one another under certain conditions can reduce prejudice. And you might be surprised to know, given the popularity of the contact hypothesis, that very few experiments have actually tested the conditions of contact. That is, whether cooperation is necessary. And these two studies did just that in northern Iraq, bringing together Christians and Muslims, and in India, bringing together high and low caste men. All of these participants were men, given the sports contexts and the national contexts of the studies. And what they did was they randomized whether, for example, Muslims were playing on your team and the contact was cooperative in Musa's case, or whether there was contact, but you were actually playing against Muslims if you're a Christian soccer player in northern Iraq. Another thing we love about these interventions is that it's so naturalistic that people really want to belong to join these leagues. They're measuring behavior as well as attitudes, and they're trying to go beyond sort of traditional measures of prejudice to say, well, does this also affect economic collaboration? Does this also affect policy attitudes, et cetera? Another example is done by another doctoral student, and I should mention here that another thing that unites these landmark studies is that doctoral students played an enormous role. And so, professors be put on notice that, we don't have excuses not to run these incredible studies because our students are showing us up. Kevin Munger, when he was still a doctoral student and back in the day when Twitter bots weren't necessarily as recognizable, put Twitter bots to use to test theories about whether confronting expressions of prejudice can reduce the expressions, whether there's so-called recidivism, for example, when white men used the N-word or racial slur on Twitter, he had them confronted by a bot that was randomly assigned as either identified as a white or a black man with their avatar, and high status versus low status with respect to the amount of followers that bot had. And then after the confrontation, waited months later to see whether that user would express a racial slur again. Okay. And then finally, and I swear I did not angle this just at this audience. I've been talking up this study nonstop, run by Edward Chang, but also Angela and Katie, is a corporate diversity training, an online diversity training. What we really loved about this study is that they collaborated with a actual corporation running the training. And one thing that they did was when they found out that maybe not all administrative records were exactly what they wanted to look at outcomes, they actually worked with the corporation, as I understand it, to create opportunities for employees at this corporation to do things like mentoring opportunities and taking someone out for coffee to promote them at the corporation. They track these kinds of behaviors over time. Okay, so the modal type of research is very different. And this is just a bar chart showing how we've classified in really broad categories all of the different types of training. The most popular type of intervention in the last dozen years across all the social and biomedical sciences is a category that didn't even exist the last time I did this review, which is called extended and imagined contact. So this is the same contact hypothesis, but now the intervention is either thinking about a friend who has contact with a member of the outgroup, or imagining in your own mind contact with the outgroup, a conversation and encounter. The next big category of interventions we called cognitive and emotional training. And these are just interventions in which individuals are trained to use thinking or emotional regulation strategies to fight off their personal prejudices, all right? And so I take you through those top categories to make the point that really what we've seen is that the majority of interventions over the last 12 years or so has been about prejudice reduction through mentalizing. So rather than changing aspects of the context or changing social interactions, it's really about trying to change the way you think and feel about an outgroup, and it's very individually focused. We also grabbed a term from the policy literature and had a very specific definition for it. So we coded whether all of these interventions are light touch, which we defined as brief, cheap, and easy to implement. And we got two coders to agree on whether or not this was the case. 76% of all interventions could be classified as light touch. And then finally, there are the other way I would really categorize or characterize the majority of these studies is that there are lots of methodological problems with them. So they suffer from having really small sample sizes, a lot of attrition, people dropping out, but not handling that well in the analyses, randomizing groups of people, but then analyzing it at the level of the individual without appropriate steps taken for your standard errors, and a general lack of transparency in what the intervention is and what the data are, and in general, no data sharing. So this is just a brief look at, what else is going on in these studies. In terms of types of outcomes, the vast majority are still measuring explicit attitudes or beliefs, so self-reports. They're doing so in college and on MTurk online. And the most popular type of prejudice being addressed is race and ethnicity, followed by ability. Okay, so that just gives you a feel a little bit for this population of. So here's the average effect of all studies. This is unweighted. The D is a 0.35, a standard error of 0.02. Whatever does that mean? Well, let's just take an example. If we were to use a feeling thermometer, which is a really popular way of measuring prejudice, 0 being, I feel very coldly toward this group, let's say toward Black people, and 100, I feel very warm toward Black people. Let's take someone with sort of a moderate level of prejudice. They're like a little below neutral, so they feel a little cool. If you rated yourself as a 40 toward Black people and your feelings toward Black people on the feeling thermometer, on average, all of these, the sum total of these interventions, they would move you to a 48. I'm not sure what you think about that. It's not too bad as far as social science effect sizes go, but I want to dig into this finding a little deeper. And rather than having us judge the quality of these studies or make our own personal complaints about methodology, as I just did in the previous slide, what we're going to do is take a look at this effect size by using the most hands off the scale approach to study quality. We're going to just break up our sample by sample size. Okay, so we're going to split it into quintiles, studies that had 25 or fewer people, which is the bottom quintile, and the top quintile is studies that had 78 or more people in the treatment group. Okay, so using quintiles, you see just, in fact, how few people there are in studies all over the place. And what you should be looking at now is this column in the table that says effect size. We should not see a relationship between the average effect of the intervention and the sample size, right? Because it's a sign of publication bias if the small studies report really big effects, right? Because in order to be published, then the small studies would have to find some enormous effect size. The trouble is that is exactly what we find. There's almost a linear effect in which the treatment sample size of 25 or fewer people finds an effect of 0.6, almost double that of the average. And the top quintile with the most people in it finds an effect size of 0.187. Okay, so here it is again, just depicted graphically. So you see how there's this linear relationship between sample size and effect size. And what does this effect size mean if we're taking just the top quintile, just looking at how many people were in the study? Now the effect size of 0.187 would move someone from a 40 to a 44. Okay, so it's a lot less impressive. And this is a figure just to show you that this is happening for any kind of intervention. So you see there's variation in, you can pick whatever favorite intervention of yours is listed here. These are all of the studies in the population of studies. And this is when now we restrict the population to studies that have a sample size of 78 or greater in the treatment group. So you see that, it's moving towards 0 in terms of the average effect. And the confidence intervals are overlapping with 0 in several cases. One place I want to draw your attention to on this figure is look all the way down to the bottom to diversity trainings. The other thing to notice about this is that by reducing the number, of studies to those with, 70 or more in the sample size, now you see that there are only 2 studies of diversity training. I've already told you about one of them, right? In the entire past 12 years that can speak to the question of whether or not diversity trainings are working or having a causal impact. And so this brings me to the one of the final points that I previewed in the beginning, which is that some of the most popular prejudice reduction ideas are not well supported. Think about diversity training. This is the recommendation. This is the off-the-shelf answer we have whenever a racist or a sexist or a any kind of event with religious or any other kind of bias happens in almost all of our organizations, whether they're corporate or nonprofit or governmental, et cetera, right? I'm sure all of you have been through a diversity training, if not this year, then recently. But there are 2 experimental studies measuring their impacts currently in the past 12 years. Implicit bias is another. Implicit bias is something that has a lot of popular currency. It's a very good way to introduce the topic of bias. I think it relaxes a lot of people's defenses. But are the trainings working? This is a growing literature, but there are still so few studies measuring the impact of implicit bias trainings in particular. And the other thing we were trying to do in this research is to see whether, if you are just measuring implicit bias, it could be any kind of intervention, what is the relationship between reducing or trying to affect implicit bias and behavior? So if you can manage to reduce implicit bias, does that also have an impact on behavior? Unfortunately, this is another case where there isn't evidence of absence. We're not saying that there's no relationship between implicit attitudes and behavior, but there's complete absence of evidence. There's just very few studies, in fact, again, 2 coincidentally, that actually measure both implicit attitudes and behavior in the same study. So we really can't speak to these things. And then finally, I think that a really popular way to frame a lot of the small, incremental changes that are produced by a lot of behavioral studies in general, but especially in the prejudice reduction field, is to say, well, the advances are small, but these processes are recursive. Small changes build over time. They set off other processes, and these can grow into something quite meaningful over time. Again, we just find no evidence of this. We don't find evidence against this, but we looked to see what studies were measuring effects longitudinally, and to see whether we could find whether actually effects, maintain or even grow over time. And we don't find evidence of this. So this is something that the field needs to be really careful about, justifying why small effects are important, because we don't have evidence of these kinds of recursive building processes. Okay, so once more with feeling, this is pretty much the same data that I showed you already, but I'm using this figure now to make the final case about how the best research shows very small effects. And I want to show it to you in this way because the sobering implication of this figure, when we fit it with this linear regression, is that given all of the data, you see the effect size in the x-axis there, how big of an impact we're having on the x-axis, and how much variance or error there is in the study on the x-axis, and the effect sizes on the y. What we're showing here is that given all of the data over the past dozen years, if we were to, based on this, do more and more rigorous studies, correcting all of the methodological errors, but just continuing along the same path, and we just reduce that standard error, what we might find is a bunch of studies that actually find no effect of our interventions, all right? So it's not just that we're not finding the effect that's there. What these data are implying is that if we just do better and better studies, bigger and badder, bolder and more tightly controlled RCTs, we would actually be showing that our interventions are just not working. Okay, so that's the most sobering figure for me of this entire work. Okay, so given this, what should the next generation of prejudice reduction research look like, an intervention? In our paper, we make a lot of recommendations, both for people who are interested in doing field work, who are interested in working with practitioners, measuring the effects of these field interventions, but also for those who are interested in making really tight, controlled insights in the laboratory. So we have a lot of suggestions for early career researchers and late career researchers who want to really try to make some progress on a lot of these burning questions. But I want to focus the rest of our discussion today on what I think is a little bit of a bolder step and definitely less developed for us. This is the stuff of op-eds and not worked out theories and empirical findings. We really want to invite the field to think about a different model of change. We're questioning to ourselves right now whether we're just designing the right interventions after looking at these data. And we really want to invite you especially to think about intervening in structures. So let me spend the last amount of time on what I mean by that. So our current model of change, as I see it, is that we think of prejudice as a psychological problem. We're trying to change people's minds. We're trying to change their perceived norms, their personal behaviors. And we're doing that by we have a mental model in which we need to match the problem with the intervention. We need individualized psychological treatments to try to get into people's minds, change the way they think about these things, to create individual change, and then hope also that this scales up to societal change. I want to propose an alternative model, which is to say, let's not try to actually attack psychological issues with psychological answers, but rather with structural interventions. And in order to create that individual psychological change, the psychology still matters, attitudes and individual behavior still matters, but we should attack it with more structural types of interventions rather than individualized, mentalizing types of interventions. What does that mean? So obviously, when we think about structure, we think about things like institutions, rules, and leaders, the kinds of decisions they make, the communications that they broadcast, and so forth. But we should also be thinking about more invisible structures, so social structures, and these kinds of things. Some examples are mass collective experiences through the mass media, through social media, unofficial organizations. I'll use social media example one more time, which is to say, think about Black Twitter, right? There's no board of directors for this, but it reaches, millions of people and has a great impact on public opinion as well. Large in-person gatherings or Zoom gatherings, simultaneous collective experiences. So we're not trying to get you to think about ways to scale up individualized treatments, but rather how can we make individualized treatments and predictions into more of a collective experience? Because that is what these kinds of more tangible structures like institutions and law, that's what they do as well. So let me give you a couple of examples. I think it's a little bit hard sometimes to think about this because if you survey current theory on prejudice reduction, a lot of it is making highly individualized predictions and doesn't really involve what we would think of as structure as much. So starting with theories that do somewhat address structure, I would say that social norms theory, for example, does make predictions about things like leadership, that leaders can signal new norms about the unacceptability of prejudice. There's different ways that you could take that prediction. So I think, up to this point, many folks have said, okay, that's good. So I'm going to send out emails to people reminding them or text messages reminding them of, what their leaders think or how their leaders are progressive. But a more structural way of thinking about this is, let's try to understand, for example, what happens to people's attitudes and perceived norms when the Supreme Court makes an announcement, right? This is a very collective experience, and that's one direction that we're trying to take in my lab. But consider also really highly individualized hypotheses and theories. So one really popular theory right now in prejudice reduction is perspective taking. So whether or not taking or getting the perspective of others is sufficient to create empathy or to change your position on issues of stigmatized groups, et cetera. I think a great example of what we mean by a structural intervention that takes this theory is the Brockman and Kalla canvassing interventions, where they involve a perspective getting exercise in every single canvassing event when people answer their doors, and that's the discussion that takes place. What's structural about this to us is that not only is there a social component of what's going on, it's not just a text message, for example, people answering the door are aware that this is part of an entire campaign strategy. So many people in their neighborhood, or at least those who are answering their doors, are getting this treatment at the same time as them. And that is a way in which it's more of a social structure rather than just an individualized mentalizing experience. There are a lot of examples, I would say, coming out of economics and especially economic history right now, in which people are trying to understand the role of institutions on individual psychological processes. So those who have looked at the institution of slavery on ideology today, or those who have used experiments or natural experiments to look at the rollout of, for example, policies to increase gender representation in government, and to look to see whether gender bias changes in the years following that rollout. So these examples are finding large socially and policy relevant changes. And I think that given the small effects that we're finding in the literature right now, we take this as a mandate to try to achieve the kind of changes that we're seeing in some of this retrospective work on institutions and psychological change. So the way we're going to have to get there is to really improve our skills, and I include myself in that, at thinking about what are the structural expressions of our theories, of our behavioral theories. How do we design a more structural intervention, not so individualized an experience, something that changes the context around people, not just the way they think about that context. I think that it demands a more interdisciplinary social science. Some of the feedback we've already gotten also encourages us to think about what kinds of research would support this foray into more structural thinking. So I'm in particular thinking about research on how leaders can introduce top-down change. Do you introduce it as a moral imperative or as a instrumental move for the corporation? I think research like that is going to be very important for this next generation of prejudice reduction research. I think just more generally, it involves and implicates social scientists in a push for equity reform, because equity reform now becomes your intervention if you're thinking about how structural change, what it means for the way that we think about groups and we hold prejudice, right? So while there's plenty of justification for pushing for equity, say more Black board members at a corporation, right? So instead of running an intervention or running an evaluation of a white fragility training at a company and hoping that then down the line there are more Black board members, rather pushing for more Black board members and then measuring whether there's less white fragility a few years later. That's the logic of this. It'll also involve lots of different causal identification strategies, which I'm sure many people on this call are already using. But for some behavioral scientists, that will be a foray into new ways of thinking about methodology and causal inference. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited about your questions.
Thank you, Betsy. That was wonderful. And I learned a lot in spite of spending time studying this. I feel like, anyway, thank you. I'm sure you taught all of us so much. So, okay, we have a lot of different kinds of questions, and I actually think, so we only have about 10 minutes for questions. I was thinking I'd start with a few that are sort of methodological clarifying questions and then dive to the more philosophical after that. So let me start with a couple just simple ones. One of our participants, Ross O'Hara, asked if you could say something more about the time frame the studies tend to look at. He noted, differences. Are the differences after a week? Are they after a month? When, how does that look?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's another sobering stat. If we had, we previously did a meta-analysis of all contact experiments, and we said we were going to try to make it policy relevant by limiting it to only studies that measured more than an hour later, I believe it was. It was either an hour or a few hours, I forget. That drastically drops the number of studies that can be included. So that's why we did not do this here. But most studies are immediate measurements. Not so much with the field studies, but it's a really short time period afterward. Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. Another clarifying question from Rafael Batista, who's a PhD student at UChicago. He wants to know if you could say a little bit more about how prejudice is being defined. So is it being measured from the target's perspective, or from the, he calls them perpetrators, or as you know, discrimination in hiring? Is there a standard, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, so it's prejudice from it's the prejudice of the perpetrator. We did not include studies that, I think this is where he's going with this question. We didn't include studies that were simply trying to improve relations between groups. So, you know, trying to get people to get along better if it was targeting the stigmatized group. So this was really targeting the dominant group. And we really defined it very broadly. We tried to include, you know, just pure like discrimination reduction studies as well, if this was just about preferences and so forth.
Okay, that's great. And one final clarification that has gotten a lot of votes is that an anonymous attendee asked, could it just be that there's not much prejudice to begin with? And so the reason that there's such small effect sizes is that there's low baseline rates of prejudice, so there's not much movement to achieve. I have a feeling I know what you'll say, but I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, this is no. I relish the opportunity to answer this question. I think that one way to answer this question would be to say, well, is it just because no one wants to self-report prejudice, and so you don't get as much movement? That could very well be, and it points to the problem of just using self-reports. It, you know, harkens back to James Baldwin. You know, I don't care what you say, I want to know what you do. I think that, you know, fortunately, much of the world has woken up to the idea that there is an enormous amount of prejudice in this world, not just anti-Black prejudice, but we've been focused a lot on that, and that we should be concerned about both explicit and implicit prejudice, because we've seen a lot of explicit prejudice, you know, on display. And so I would say the other way to answer this is that no, there's an enormous amount of prejudice in the world, and it's up to us to be able to measure it well, and its decrease, hopefully.
Okay, so let's get into some issues beyond definition. So let's see. Neil Lewis Jr. is asking, one thing he found interesting is that you said a lot of the promising studies are being led by junior people and graduate students, and he's curious to hear your thoughts on how institutions can help support them to continue doing this work given different career pressures.
Yeah, that's great. Hi, Neil. I think that, well, I think that it's a sign that things are already changing, that folks are doing such ambitious work, and I think that it's getting rewarded. So I think that's the good news. But like any ambitious work, I think that we have to shift our standards of, you know, how productive everyone needs to be, and also our standards about what collaboration looks like and how people should be rewarded for collaboration, because this is not going to be a single person enterprise. It's going to be a group effort. I think that we need to rethink standards also for who gets credit, even from communities that we collaborate with, and not just academic folks, so that, you know, in some ways that there's an incentive for people with whom we're collaborating. But that's the short answer to that.
I love that thought, especially, you know, having tried to do this work with organizations and how their incentives are very misaligned, right? Because if they share data and things don't look good, they're worried about court. So how can we shine a light on them?
Yeah, that's a whole other seminar, and I'd be so curious what you do about that, and how you make it of mutual interest. But that's one of the, you know, primary challenges of doing engaged work.
So hard. Sunita Saw has a really interesting question. She wants to know what your thoughts are on having implicit bias and prejudice reduction training at a younger age, perhaps even in middle school. Is there any evidence that age could relate to impact?
I would say that I want to first shout out the educational psychologists and developmental psychologists. They're some of the only areas of research that are actually pretty well developed in terms of finding causal impacts. And this goes back to the 70s and 80s, when educational psychologists primarily were studying cooperative learning. And they were doing so in newly desegregated schools. And they measured not just achievement, which was the main focus of cooperative learning, but also racial and ethnic attitudes and interactions, even interactions in the playground. So there's actually like a more well-developed body of work for young people, but we don't know yet how long lasting that is. We don't have enough good data to really compare that to imagine some sort of plasticity, continuum where you need to be hit with this early on. I mean, one thing I'll say is that I think that there's a lot of conversation right now about how implicit bias talk has downsides to it. It can be exculpatory, and there's a negative effect of that. The other effect that psychologists talk about, just in terms of providing vocabulary or just like opening up a discussion, is that there could be a benefit for doing things young to give young people a vocabulary, so that then when they engage with this kind of issue, whether it's a policy issue or an actual training when they're older, they have language to talk about it. And so that's a completely empirically uninformed conclusion that I have, just looking at all of the debates around implicit bias and knowing what's out there for both younger people and older people.
Great. Okay, this is a question from Mahmoud Bayazit. I hope I pronounced that all right, Mahmoud. It's a great question. Mahmoud asks if there are any studies examining individual differences that moderate reaction to these interventions, and if so, what kind of individual differences did they study, if any?
I agree. This is a fantastic question. And I apologize, but I'm going to answer it with passion, but methodologically speaking, again, if you only have 78 people in your treatment group, you cannot get to heterogeneous effects. You can't even get to main effects. And so that was one of our enormous frustrations in reviewing this literature, is that, in fact, many of the papers that had such small sample sizes, they were reporting out heterogeneous effects. And that's something that's incentivized in the behavioral and especially psychological literature. Is a way to build theory is to understand how this affects liberals versus conservatives, those with modern racism and lower modern racism, etc. But we are not yet at that stage. We are so far away from that kind of theory building, and it's all due to methods. And I'll say that, Katie, that was something that we really appreciated about your diversity training paper, is that you were one of the very few studies in our database that could get at heterogeneous effects. And you found really provocative things there. You found that the people who were most affected behaviorally were the people already on board. And, it's a sad finding, but it's something that we need to know. I think, that was just the right message that the diversity training literature, needed, was this one-off, one-day online training really preached to the choir. And I super appreciated that. And Angela, thank you for that too. Sorry.
I did not appear because I wanted to be praised. I was appearing as a visual cue as well, Tiki, but thank you so much, Betsy. That's very kind.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words. And wow, what an amazing talk. This is just so much to chew on and so important. So thank you for that. And also, timely, just couldn't be more timely. Although we've been talking about this every year, we're obviously talking about it more right now.
Well, thank you. And I will say this, I think usually the like whoever it is, Katie or Angela, who gets to appear, also foreshadows or invites everyone, including you, Betsy, to next week's talk. Although I have to say, Katie, could you do that, because I closed the document that I was supposed to.
Okay, yes, next week we have the amazing Francesca Gino from Harvard University, and her title is Piqued Curiosity. So we hope your curiosity is piqued. I know mine is. I think it will be a really interesting talk as well. This was just a fantastic way to end February. So thank you, Betsy, for.
And Betsy, you said the annual review is out now, right? It's available.
It is. It's online, okay. And it's also on my website. Yeah.
Okay. Required reading.
When we send out the video of this, which we will do as soon as it's available, we'll try to add that annual review link so people have both of those resources. And really appreciate all you're doing for the field. Awesome. Thank you, Betsy, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day, and see you folks next Monday.
See you, Betsy. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.